The key to understanding the difference between implicit and explicit memory could start with just one simple image. Imagine Sigmund Freud on a bicycle. Now, Freud, as you probably know, was a major theorist of the unconscious. And riding a bike is usually an unconscious activity once you've picked up the skill. You know, there's things like procedural memory involved in being able to remember it over the long term and not ride a bike for a very long time and still quickly pick up that skill. But that's generally what implicit memory involves. It's learning skills and then being able to more or less remember them on autopilot. You don't really have to focus on it very, very much because it's implicitly learned. And some of our habits, our behaviors, parts of our personality where we're just automatically that way, and we sometimes say, well, I can't change because that's just the way that I am. There's truth to that, and it has to do with implicit memory because of the unconscious nature of how things are learned and then projected forward unconsciously in our behaviors. Now, that's the implicit memory part of it. Imagine Freud now consciously remembering a time he saw an explicit memory. He's actually trying to think, what was that memory that I saw? And it's the conscious act of remembering with intent that makes that kind of behavior a explicit memory behavior, trying to explicitly draw upon your memory. And then you have the explicit trying to learn something like the title of a book. And it really is that simple at the starting level. And now you have a simple way to remember the difference. Using the Freud image on a bike and having him watch a explicit movie, maybe that he's trying to remember the title of explicitly, may not be the right image for you, but it is a mnemonic way to start sorting out how that you could remember those two things. But just remember that riding a bike is an implicit skill, and consciously using your memory to recall something is an explicit skill. Of course, there are a few nuances to each of these types of memory. So in this mini masterclass on explicit versus implicit memory, we're going to dive in and reveal all. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmerymethod.com. If you're new here and you love deep dives into the nature of memory, get subscribed, hit that thumbs up, and let's go. As the authors of the development of implicit and explicit memory point out, philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and other types of scientists have been defining these two types of memory since around the late 1800s. Basically, these terms are concepts that are tested by different means. Implicit memory, or unconscious memory related to skills that you just seem to know, and you might not remember learning how to use a fork, but you know it. This is often explored through what are called priming tests. And one way to think about this type of memory is that you retain the knowledge without necessarily remembering how you got it. And you can test yourself. I mean, do you really remember the first time that you learned how to use chopsticks? Or how about, do you remember picking up a glass to drink? I think it's fair to say that most people won't have memories of the first time they used such skills, but they do remember how to perform these common operations. You don't have to think back at all. Whereas explicit memory, on the other hand, it's normally tested by recall and recognition tests. And anytime that you want to test your explicit memory is, learn an instrument that you don't already know. And then you have to think, okay, where was G on the guitar? And all the different places that G can appear. I mean, you have to explicitly learn it, and you have to then explicitly ask yourself these questions until it becomes implicit. And that's when you can, rock out a jazz solo, for example, because you just implicitly know where G is all over the fretboard. And in some of the tests, you may be asked to recall your last birthday, and you can probably tap into your episodic and your autobiographical memory consciously and share a decent amount of information about the event. Because we explicitly need to call our birthday back over and over and over again, the actual date. And then because of things that we acquire, like gifts and so forth, we're getting into autobiographical memory, episodic memory, and we can probably explicitly draw upon it to craft a story. Oh yes, I got a certain book, etc. And this is really, really important, whereas you can't really remember maybe when you learned how to use a straw. Now, to this day, the conscious element remains the key distinguishing factor in most studies that I've read. In fact, most people don't really think about riding a bike and associate this simple procedure with memory, but it is a memory-based skill, even if you don't consciously think about it that way. And that lack of consciousness around things is precisely the point. Forgive me if I repeat this, but implicit equals unconscious, explicit equals conscious. And why do we repeat things when we're teachers? Because we're trying to make the point explicit. So sometimes people complain, get to the point. Sometimes people say you repeat yourself too much, etc. And those complaints are always a little bit weird to me, because you may be ahead of the game as a student, but others aren't. And we are trying to use what we know about education and pedagogy and so forth to really make sure these things sink in, because we often unconsciously, through memory biases, push things away. And often people who think that they've gotten the point haven't actually gotten the point, because memory biases are causing them to try to make shortcuts. It's not universally true, but it's something to think about. And think about your own implicit memory behaviors. Why are you so impatient sometimes? I'm impatient sometimes too. And I try to catch myself and think, why am I impatient here? And you know, a lot of the time what ends up happening is I realize that I actually do need to get more explicit memory involved, because I am not paying the attention that I should. So try to make things never an all or nothing sort of skill, you know, or this is too much repetition and so forth. A lot of what we do is repetition, period. And we want to make sure that we are repeating things within a context and with as much larger context as possible and connections between things. So this is a really, really important part of everything. You know, you can really get more out of your memory by making sure that you pay attention to what it is, how it operates, and thinking about how that it's operating against you sometime. So one thing that you can do as an exercise as well is go and ask your parents about how you learn certain things. See what they remember. Just because you don't remember when you learned how to walk doesn't mean that you can't learn more of the story of how you learned how to walk. All right, so ultimately, explicit and implicit memory are interlinked, and having a healthy relationship with them matters for a really simple reason, because they are not independent. If you want to be a free member of society, you need to remember simple operations like how to open doors, how to operate different tools, or whatever you need to do. You need to remember passwords, you need to remember names, words, numbers. And as the author of the Handbook of Implicit Learning points out, without all of these memory levels intact, it's impossible to learn any kind of sequence, because there is a implicit and explicit component to a lot of these things. Like entering a password, you have to remember how to actually press buttons or whatever the password requires, typing on a keyboard, and you have to remember the semantic content. So it's explicit and implicit at the same time in so many tasks. In writing, you have to implicitly remember how to move a pencil fluidly, but you need explicit memory to help you recall individual words and all kinds of nuance that you could string together in order to make jokes, in order to drive home a point, in order to convince people of your point, etc. So without these two levels of memory working flawlessly, you would have a hard time doing many things in life. So let's talk a little bit about keeping both of these levels in good shape. And fortunately, it's quite easy to do. One simple way is to practice making plans. This exercise is what's called your prospective memory. And when you make good on your plans, such as meeting with friends, you're going to use your implicit memory while traveling and your explicit memory while you're chatting with them. And you can make other plans that don't involve chatting with people, of course. But anytime that you're planning and you're practicing the act of planning, you're getting a lot of memory exercise, and then even more when you execute on the plan. Other activities would be studying music, which I've mentioned, learning a language, taking courses, taking notes on courses or taking notes on videos like these, using a memory palace, learning a number skill like maybe the Trachtenberg method. The key is to just combine as many activities as you can throughout life. And if you'd like more memory exercises that will keep your mind sharp, you can always go to the Magnetic Memory Method website and get my free memory improvement kit, or just dive into the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. These exercises that I have for you there in terms of building memory palaces, learning how to use images inside of those memory palaces, they're going to keep both skills well practiced. And memory champions and mnemonists are very similar in that they learn to rapidly dig through their explicit memory for mnemonic images implicitly. So they see incoming information like 79 and they instantly think of Captain Crunch because they use a system that helps you do that, and they're able to do it automatically. So it takes a bit of practice, of course, but if you learn to use these memory techniques, you'll get to the point that it's automatic or near automatic. And this mental activity is so rewarding because it packs your mind with so much knowledge so much faster, and it makes it recalling it easier. So if the difference between implicit and explicit memory isn't clear enough for you yet, now please let me know in the chat if you have any questions or in the comments below. And think about Freud on his way to a movie theater on a bicycle, if that image helps you, or come up with your own image, because even going through the steps of coming up with your own image is going to help you exercise both of these memories, because you'll learn to do it more automatically and you'll explicitly dig through associations that you already have at your fingertips, and it will make a difference that matters. So let's move now to what I'm reading now, and it connects to the difference between implicit and explicit memory. This is a really big book, and it's called Ars Notoria. This is the version, the new translation by Matthias Cassel. He's going to be on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast soon with an interview to talk about this. Why that I connect this to our topic here today of implicit and explicit memory is, just in broad strokes, the Ars Notoria is about using prayers, specifically calling upon or meditating upon and chanting the names of angels to help you learn the 7 liberal arts faster. So it's a medieval era text, but it was very, very popular for a very long time. We've talked about it on this channel before with Dr. Justin Sledge, and I'm really, really excited to deepen that conversation, because up until now, there wasn't a very good version of it in English. Certainly not one that contains images of the actual Notoria that you can meditate upon and all. It's just, this is very, very readable version. So I'm really excited about that. And the other thing about it is that any kind of act that you do where you're reflecting on the nature of information and you're pre-envisioning what it is that you would like to see in terms of an outcome, well, that's kind of what we talked about today in terms of planning. So we want to plan more than just, praying to angels that will help us learn the 7 liberal arts faster. But I can imagine that during that era, this would have caused people to focus more on the practical realities of what they needed to do and how they needed to do it, and they may well have felt guided. I had a thought while I was reading Ars Notoria that sometimes, this thing comes up in your mind. Oh, I have to do this, and I better do that, and maybe I better write down these steps in order and have a to-do list so I don't forget them. It could be in earlier periods of time that people thought that that insight, that idea that comes back to you that you should be doing this, that, or the other thing, people may have thought that those ideas were not themselves generating it, but angels. Anyway, I don't know if that's true or not. We will talk about that with Matthias Cassel, and that's what I'm reading now. Thanks, everybody, for joining me on this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Come visit me at magneticmemorymethod.com and Freud your way to an explicit movie on a bicycle so that you can remember the difference, or share with me a different mnemonic solution that you come up with so that you can remember better what these differences are. Thanks again, and until we speak again, keep yourself magnetic.